The emergency klaxons had long since fallen silent, leaving only the crackling of damaged circuits and the eerie creaks of the failing hull. Smoke coiled through the fractured remains of the escape pod, its once pristine surface now scorched and torn. Commander Elias Carter groaned, his body protesting as he pried himself free from the wreckage. Every breath burned in his lungs, each movement a reminder that survival had come at a cost. He staggered to his feet, scanning the alien landscape stretching before him. Towering obsidian spires jutted from the ground like the petrified fingers of some ancient giant, their surfaces slick with bioluminescent veins that pulsed in slow, rhythmic patterns. The sky overhead was a deep violet, streaked with wisps of emerald-green clouds that shimmered under the light of an unseen sun. Elias grimaced. This was not the planned evacuation zone. His ship had been ambushed by an unknown fleet, and the emergency beacon had malfunctioned mid-descent. Now, stranded and alone, he had no idea if rescue was even possible. His suit's systems flickered erratically, the display struggling to maintain power. One thing was certain. If he didn't find shelter soon, this planet's unwelcoming terrain would finish what the crash had started. A shadow moved along the ridge above. Elias froze, instincts honed by years of combat surging to the forefront. His hand went to the sidearm at his hip, though his grip was weak. He wasn't in any condition for a fight, but he'd be damned if he went down without one. The figure stepped forward, and the sight nearly made him forget his injuries. She was unlike any being he had encountered before, tall and slender, draped in regal, iridescent robes that seemed to shift between shades of deep sapphire and silver with every movement. Her skin was a pale, near-translucent hue, as if carved from polished marble, and her piercing, luminescent eyes, devoid of pupils, regarded him with an unreadable expression. Xelari. He recognized the species from classified intelligence reports, though few humans had encountered them up close. They were known for their unparalleled intellect, their rigid adherence to logic, and most of all, their complete lack of emotion. The woman tilted her head slightly, studying him as though he were an unusual specimen rather than a wounded soldier in need of aid. "You are human," she said at last, her voice smooth yet utterly devoid of warmth. Elias coughed, pressing a hand to his aching ribs. "Yeah, and you are." Surprisingly calm about that. The Xelari's expression did not change. "I expected your kind to be more volatile. You are injured. This is inefficient." A bitter laugh escaped him before he could stop it. "Tell me about it." She regarded him for a moment longer before stepping forward, moving with a grace that seemed almost unnatural. He tensed, but she did not attack. Instead, she reached out and touched a small device at her wrist. A translucent screen appeared in the air between them, flickering with unreadable symbols. "You should not be here," she said. "Trust me, it wasn't my first choice." The screen vanished, and she let out a slow breath, almost as if contemplating something beyond his understanding. Then, without warning, she reached for him. He instinctively recoiled, but his legs buckled, and the world tilted dangerously. Before he could hit the ground, she caught him with ease, supporting his weight as though he were nothing more than a fragile artifact in need of preservation. "Your condition is deteriorating," she noted, as if merely observing a failing experiment. "I will take you to shelter." Elias blinked at her, trying to reconcile her cold demeanor with the fact that she was actively helping him. "And why would you do that?" The Xelari paused, as if the question itself was alien to her. "Because allowing you to die here serves no purpose." Not exactly the most reassuring answer. But at the moment, Elias didn't have the luxury of arguing. His body was betraying him, his vision swooning at the edges. His only hope lay in trusting this strange, emotionless alien who should have had no reason to care whether he lived or died. As darkness threatened to pull him under, one last thought flickered through his mind. If the Xelari truly felt nothing, then why had she hesitated? Elias woke to the sound of rhythmic humming, a low, pulsating resonance that seemed to vibrate through the walls around him. His eyelids felt heavy, but the sting of raw nerves and aching muscles forced him back into awareness. His body was no longer slumped against jagged rock and cold earth. Instead, he was lying on a smooth, firm surface that adjusted to his shape, cradling him like memory foam. His fingers twitched against the material, its texture soft but oddly resistant, like something alive. He forced his eyes open, and the world around him came into focus. The room was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was vast yet intimate, the walls shimmering as if woven from liquid metal. Thin veins of glowing blue light traced intricate patterns across the curved surfaces, pulsating in sync with the humming sound that filled the air. The architecture was impossibly seamless. There were no doors, no visible seams, just a smooth, organic flow to every surface. He tried to push himself up, but a sharp pain lanced through his ribs, forcing him to grit his teeth. A presence moved nearby, and his muscles tensed on instinct. The Xelari woman stood at the far end of the room, her back to him, her hands hovering over a floating console of shifting glyphs. She moved with the same effortless grace as before, her iridescent robes barely disturbing the air as she turned toward him. "You are awake," she observed. Elias exhaled sharply. "No kidding." She stepped closer, studying him with the same unreadable expression. "You require additional healing, but your physiology is inefficient. Your recovery rate is slow." "Gee, thanks for the encouragement," he muttered, shifting uncomfortably under her gaze. "Where am I?" "You are within my personal habitat," she replied, as if that answered everything. "Your injuries required stabilization. I have ensured your survival." Elias let his head fall back against the strange surface beneath him. "So, what? I owe you a favor now. You expecting some kind of debt?" The Xelari blinked at him, as if the very concept was alien. Debt implies obligation. Obligation implies emotional attachment. I have neither. "Right." Elias rubbed a hand over his face. "And yet here I am, alive, thanks to you." There was a pause. A long one. The hum in the walls remained steady, and for a moment, it seemed as if the room itself was listening. "I was curious," she admitted finally. Elias lifted a brow. "Curious." "You are human," she said, as if that explained everything. "Your species is an anomaly. In every recorded encounter, humans act against their own survival logic. You prioritize the weak. You sacrifice the strong. You feel emotions with an intensity that disrupts rational order. I wish to observe this closer." He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "So I'm a science project now." Her expression did not change. "It is a rare opportunity. A live subject allows for better data." Elias huffed. "Glad to be of service." He sat up slowly, wincing at the effort. "You got a name?" There was a hesitation, brief but noticeable. "I am called Seris." "Seris," he repeated, testing the sound. "Well, Seris, I appreciate the whole not letting me die thing." She tilted her head. "That is an emotional response." "Yeah, that's kind of my thing." Elias studied her, noting the subtle flicker in her glowing eyes. "And something tells me you're not as emotionless as you like to pretend." Her gaze remained steady, but something about her stillness felt off. It was too rigid, too controlled, as if she were suppressing something she didn't quite understand. "I do not experience emotions," she said carefully. "Only the remnants of them, echoes of what my kind evolved beyond." "Aha." Elias leaned forward, despite the pain in his ribs. "And yet, you saved me. You brought me here instead of letting me bleed out in the dirt. Seems like a pretty emotional decision to me." Seris did not answer immediately. The pulsing light in the walls dimmed slightly, as if reflecting her uncertainty. "Preservation of unique specimens is logical," she said at last. Elias smirked. "Right, keep telling yourself that." She turned away, returning to her console, but her fingers hesitated over the shifting glyphs. Elias saw it this time. The smallest flicker of doubt, the briefest hesitation, like a crack in flawless glass. Maybe she was right. Maybe the Xelari had evolved beyond emotion. But if that was true, why did she look so uncertain? Elias sat on the strange, cushioned surface, stretching his sore muscles as his body adjusted to consciousness. The dull ache in his ribs remained, but it was manageable. The fact that he was alive at all still surprised him. His last memory before blacking out had been the cold grip of death closing in, his body barely holding together. Now he was inside an alien structure, healed by hands that claimed to feel nothing. Seris stood across from him, her glowing eyes fixed on the shifting glyphs hovering above her console. Her posture was perfectly composed, yet Elias could sense something beneath the surface, an undercurrent of hesitation. He had spent his entire life reading people, knowing when they were bluffing, when they were nervous, when they were lying to themselves. And Seris, for all her cold detachment, was not as unreadable as she thought. The air between them hummed with quiet tension. You gonna keep staring at that thing, or are we gonna talk about the fact that you saved me for no logical reason? Elias asked, his voice cutting through the silence. Seris did not look up. I have already provided my explanation. Yeah, something about studying my illogical behavior. He swung his legs over the side of the strange bed. But I don't buy it. Her fingers hovered over the console, but she did not respond. The pulsing lights within the walls dimmed slightly, as if mirroring her uncertainty. Elias leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. If I was just another subject to you, you wouldn't have brought me here. You wouldn't have taken the risk. He gestured around. This place, wherever we are, feels personal, not just some lab. And something tells me the rest of your kind wouldn't approve of what you've done. Seris finally met his gaze. You assume much. I assume just enough, Elias countered. You hesitated before telling me your name. You didn't have to heal me, but you did. You claim to be beyond emotions, yet everything about you tells me you're lying, or maybe lying to yourself. Her expression remained unreadable, but her fingers clenched slightly before relaxing again. A small, barely noticeable movement. But Elias caught it. You believe I am compromised, she said, more of a statement than a question. Elias exhaled. I think you're more human than you'd like to admit. A flicker of something passed through her luminous eyes, so brief he almost missed it. Frustration, annoyance, or something deeper. She turned away, her robes shifting like liquid metal as she moved. The Xelari do not experience emotions as you do, she said. Our minds operate on a higher level, refined beyond the chaos of primitive instincts. Elias smirked. Yeah. Then why do you sound defensive? She stilled, her back to him, shoulders squared with a tension that was impossible to miss. The silence stretched between them, thick and charged. Elias pushed himself up, testing his balance. His limbs felt heavier than usual, like he was still shaking off the aftereffects of whatever healing process she had used on him. The room around him pulsed with a soft, rhythmic energy, almost like a heartbeat. Seris, he said, more softly this time. You saved me, and whether you want to admit it or not, that means something. She turned her head slightly, but not enough for him to see her face. You believe all actions must be driven by feeling. Not all of them, but the ones that matter. Yeah. He took a step closer, careful not to push too hard. Tell me something. When you saw me dying out there, when you chose to take me in instead of leaving me, was it purely logic? She did not answer. Not immediately. The pulsing light within the walls flickered again, dimming and brightening in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Elias sighed. I don't need you to admit it out loud. I already know the truth. Seris finally turned to face him fully, her glowing eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made his breath hitch for just a moment. You presume to understand me, human, she said, voice as smooth and measured as ever. But your perception is clouded by your own nature. You see emotions where there are none. You search for meaning in actions that require no deeper explanation. Elias studied her for a long moment. Maybe, or maybe you just don't want to face the truth. She stepped toward him then, closing the distance between them. She was taller than him by a few inches, her presence both commanding and ethereal. "And what truth is that?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. He met her gaze without hesitation. "That you care." The space between them crackled with something neither of them wanted to name. Something unspoken, fragile, and undeniable. Seris did not move, did not blink. But Elias saw it. The smallest shift in her breathing, the way her fingers twitched as if suppressing an urge she did not understand. Then, just as quickly, the moment passed. She stepped back, turning away. "You require nourishment. Your body is still weak. I will provide sustenance." Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He watched as she moved toward a section of the wall, where a panel shifted and parted like liquid metal. She was running, not physically, but emotionally, and that told him everything he needed to know. Elias sat on the edge of the strange, metallic sleeping platform, watching Seris move through the room with an ease that felt almost too controlled. Every movement she made was precise, purposeful, as if she had rehearsed them 1,000 times before. And yet, he could feel the tension beneath it all. Subtle, but there. The way her fingers lingered for just a second longer than necessary over the controls, the way her shoulders stiffened when he spoke. She was trying to act indifferent, but Elias wasn't buying it. The room hummed with the quiet energy of the Xelari vessel. The walls pulsed with that rhythmic glow, casting soft light against Seris' silver-toned robes as she activated a nearby panel. A section of the wall melted away, revealing a compartment filled with small metallic containers. She retrieved one, holding it with that same unreadable expression before turning toward him. "You require sustenance," she said, extending the container toward him. Elias took it, turning it over in his hands. The material was smooth, slightly warm. "What is it?" "A nutritional supplement. It contains all necessary elements for your body's recovery." He smirked. "You mean it's alien mush?" Seris tilted her head slightly. "It is efficient." Elias cracked the seal and took a small sip. The taste was unexpected. Not bad, but not exactly appealing either. He winced. "Tastes like chalk and regret." Seris regarded him with a blank stare. "Regret is not an ingredient." He let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, figured." He took another sip, forcing it down. It wasn't the worst thing he'd ever eaten, but it definitely wasn't a steak. As he ate, Seris remained standing, watching him in that same unnervingly still manner. It was strange. She had saved him, brought him onto her ship, healed his wounds, and yet she acted like none of it had meant anything. Like it was all just part of some experiment she had detached herself from. Except Elias didn't believe that for a second. "You don't have to keep pretending, you know," he said between bites. She blinked. "Clarify." "This whole cold, emotionless alien thing you've got going on." He gestured toward her with the container. "It's an act." Seris remained impassive. "I do not act. I simply am." Elias shook his head. "Nah. See, I've met a lot of people in my life. Liars, con artists, soldiers, diplomats. And they all had one thing in common." He pointed at her. "They tried to convince themselves of something they didn't actually believe." She crossed her arms. "You are mistaken." "Am I?" He leaned forward, setting the container aside. "Because I think you do feel something. I think saving me wasn't just logical efficiency. I think it was personal." She stiffened, just slightly, but enough for Elias to notice. "I have no personal stake in your survival," she said. "You are simply an anomaly worthy of study." He chuckled. "Right, and that's why you risked going against your own people to bring me here." "Because I was just some random test subject." He shook his head. "Doesn't add up." Seris remained silent. Elias stood, taking a few steps toward her. She didn't move, didn't retreat, but her fingers curled slightly at her sides, a small, involuntary reaction. He stopped just short of her, close enough that he could see the intricate patterns of light shifting within her eyes. "You keep saying you don't feel," he said quietly, "but I think you're afraid to." Her expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in her gaze. A hesitation, a crack in the perfect wall she had built around herself. "You misunderstand," she said, her voice softer now, less rigid. "The Xelari do not experience emotion as humans do. We are beyond such primitive." "Bullshit." Elias cut her off, his voice gentle but firm. "You're not beyond anything. You're just scared of what it might mean if you let yourself feel." The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy. The hum of the ship seemed distant now, as if the entire universe had narrowed to this one moment. Seris looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time, Elias saw something raw beneath that calculated exterior, something unspoken, something she wasn't ready to name. "You presume much," she whispered. Elias smiled, just slightly. "Yeah, I do." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The air between them was charged with something Elias couldn't quite define, but he felt it in his bones. A pull, a connection, one that Seris was trying so desperately to ignore. Then, finally, she stepped back. Just an inch, but enough to reestablish the barrier between them. "You should rest," she said, her voice returning to its usual controlled tone. "Your body is still recovering." Elias exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, sure." Seris turned, moving toward the console, her back to him once more. But Elias knew now. He had seen the truth, even if she refused to acknowledge it. She wasn't as emotionless as she claimed. And sooner or later, she was going to have to face that. Elias lay on the metallic sleeping platform, staring at the ceiling as the hum of the ship filled the silence. His mind was restless, replaying every moment since he had woken up on this alien vessel. He had faced death, endured agony, and somehow ended up here, with Seris, a being who claimed to feel nothing, yet whose every action betrayed the truth she refused to admit. He turned his head slightly, watching her as she stood near the control panel, her back to him. She had been standing there for a while now, unmoving, as if lost in thought. Maybe she was. Maybe, despite everything she had told herself, everything she had been taught, she was finally starting to question. "You're thinking," he said quietly. Seris didn't turn. "I am processing." He smirked. "That's just a fancy way of saying you're thinking." A long pause. Then, softly, "Perhaps." Elias sat up, wincing slightly at the soreness in his muscles. His body was still recovering, but the pain was manageable. "You saved me, Seris. You went against your own people, risked your own safety. Why?" Her fingers hovered over the console, tense, uncertain. "You continue to ask questions with no logical answers." "Because I don't think you did it for logic," he said. "I think you did it because you cared." Seris finally turned to face him, her expression unreadable, but her eyes, those strange, shifting pools of light, held something else, something deeper. "You assume much," she said, but there was no sharpness in her tone this time, only quiet conflict. Elias stood slowly, moving toward her with careful steps. "Tell me I'm wrong, then," he challenged gently. "Look me in the eyes and tell me you don't feel anything." She held his gaze, and for the first time since he had met her, she looked vulnerable. The mask was slipping, the carefully constructed walls cracking just enough for him to see the truth beneath. "I do not know what this is," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "This feeling, it is foreign. It is disruptive. It is." She hesitated, as if the next words were too dangerous to say aloud. Elias took another step closer. "It's human." Seris inhaled sharply, a motion so uncharacteristic of her that it startled even herself. The Xelari did not gasp. They did not react to emotions they supposedly didn't have. And yet she had. Elias reached out, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, he placed his hand gently against hers. Her skin was cool, almost metallic, but there was warmth beneath it, pulsing like a quiet heartbeat. "You feel something," he murmured. "You just don't know what to do with it." Seris looked down at their hands, her fingers twitching slightly against his. She had never been touched like this before, not in a way that wasn't clinical or procedural. The Xelari did not touch for comfort. They did not seek connection. And yet, here she was, standing in the quiet hum of her ship, allowing a human to unravel something inside her she had spent her entire existence suppressing. "Your people," she said after a moment. "They are overwhelming." Elias chuckled. "Yeah, we get that a lot." She looked up at him again, and for the first time, there was no resistance in her gaze, only curiosity, fear, and something else, something she was still afraid to name. "Then teach me," she said softly. Elias blinked. "Teach you. Teach me what it means," she clarified. "To feel. To be. Human." His heart thudded in his chest, and he couldn't stop the smile that spread across his face. "Seris, I don't think that's something I can teach. It's just something you experience." She looked uncertain, as if the concept itself was impossible to grasp. But then she made a choice. Slowly, hesitantly, she turned her hand over, fingers brushing against his, as if testing the sensation. Elias tightened his grip just slightly, grounding her in that moment. "You already feel it," he told her. "You just have to stop fighting it." Seris exhaled, a slow, measured breath. "I am afraid." Elias nodded. "That's part of it too." Silence stretched between them. But this time, it wasn't cold or distant. It was warm, full of unspoken possibilities. For the first time in her existence, Seris allowed herself to feel. And for the first time in his life, Elias realized he had found something. Someone worth fighting for. The war, the politics, the differences between their species, they still existed. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Because in the vastness of space, against all odds, Xelari had learned to love.